Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to today's Animals and Society Colloquium. The Animals and Society Colloquium series is a joint effort between the Animals and Society Institute and the American Sociological Association's section on animals and society. If you are a sociologist and you're in the ASA, I highly encourage you to join the ASA section on animals and society. And I encourage everyone to be following the good work that ASI, the Animals and Society Institute, is doing it. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ken to tell you a little bit about the Animals and Society Institute and introduce our speaker and our talk today, which I know is the reason that you're here. While he does that, I would just like to let you know, you're welcome to introduce yourselves in the chat to one another, and I will moderate the chat during the talk, so you can use the chat to talk to each other. And if you have questions, you can pop them in the chat, and I'll make sure during the Q&A that those get read. We'll do introductions. The talk will be about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a time for question and answer with the audience. So with that, oh, and I should introduce myself. I'm Carol Glasser, and I'm with the Animals and Society section of the ASA. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken Shapiro.
Thank you, Carol. And again, I want to thank Carol for who's the brainchild of this colloquial series. And as she mentioned, it's a joint project between the Animals and Society section of ASA and Animals and Society Institute. As many of you may know, the Animals and Society Institute is going to be closing its doors at the end of this year. We have our primary mission has been to try to advance and facilitate the growth of the field of human animal studies. So we are currently in the process of transferring some of our major programs, particularly the HAS report and the journals, etc., to other entities, hopefully mostly universities. That transfer is in process and is going well. We will keep people updated about it as it goes forward. So it's my pleasure to introduce Cameron Whitley. I think we first met Cameron at a summer institute some years ago that Animals and Society hosted. I can't remember where it was at. Maybe you could remind me. Cameron is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. He received his PhD in sociology from Michigan State University. He specialized in environmental science and policy, gender, justice, and environmental change, and of course, animal studies. He studies issues concerning the environment, human-animal relationships, and affirming medical care. He has over 6 publications featured in places like Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Clinical Chemistry, and Annual Review of Sociology. He's a recipient of an NSF Early Career Grant. So congratulations to you about that. So with that, I will turn it back over to Carol.
Well, with that, I'm actually going to turn it on over to Cameron. Cameron, the floor is yours. We're excited today for Cameron's talk, and I am blanking on the full name. I think it's Considering Animals with Disabilities, but I will let you introduce the talk.
Fantastic. Okay, let me do the share screen here and we'll get started. Okay. Okay, can everyone see that? I think we're all
Yeah, it
all
looks
good.
great.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you all for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk about this. So as Ken mentioned, I do a lot of environmental sociology related work, animal studies work, and then kind of a sub area of the work that I do is related to affirming healthcare and disability justice. So this was one of the first projects where I really got to combine all those things together, and to think about how we talk about animals with disabilities and what that means for our care for people and for animals with disabilities. So the title of this talk today is Considerations in Talking About Animals with Disabilities. There. So I want to start with a little story. Some of you might remember this story. I'm sure there are other ones that can come to mind of animals with disabilities in various organizations. This is particularly at the National Zoo. So Basil, the possum, in 2023 was found kind of wandering in the DC suburb, injured, and was picked up and taken to a wildlife rehabilitation facility. At the time when Basil was taken in, Basil had an eye injury and a bunch of other things had happened. We don't know the extent of what Basil experienced, other than it was likely at some point a predator attack. And with that, in the rehabilitation process, it became obvious that Basil could not be returned to the wild and that Basil would not survive. So the National Zoo was interested, and Basil became a permanent resident of the National Zoo. When this happened, Basil had such fanfare in the way that they presented the story that the Atlantic picked up the story, the Today Show, among others. And so if you see over on the side, you can see some pictures of Basil. And so, most of these are from the different news outlets that publicized this story. This created a huge frenzy of people wanting to see Basil at the National Zoo, and a really interesting dynamic in talking about animals with disabilities and people with disabilities. What was really interesting about this case is that when the zoo presented Basil to the public, they didn't provide lengthy depictions of what had happened to Basil or Basil's suffering. They really focused on Basil as an individual and the different characteristics that Basil has, personality, those sorts of things. So people really latched onto that and were able to kind of see beyond this disability that Basil had. So this led us to kind of a central question. I work with a lot of zoos and aquariums all across the country. And one thing that I've noticed, because I am a disability justice scholar as well, is that zoos and aquariums and other organizations that really are animal focused often have a hard time thinking about how they talk about their animals with disabilities. So this really provoked an interesting question that we were all kind of talking about among 11 different organizations. So how do people perceive animals with disabilities based on how they are depicted? And can we find effective ways to depict animals with disabilities that increase positive perceptions of animals with disabilities and hopefully people with disabilities? In full disclosure, this work was conducted by an interdisciplinary team of 17 disability scholars and zoo and aquarium professionals. Most of the team have a congenital or acquired physical or cognitive disability, including myself. And this work represents 11 different organizations. So to talk about the rest of the presentation, I'm going to define disability because there are a lot of different definitions out there, and I think it's important that we understand what we are talking about in this presentation. I'm going to give you a tiny bit of background on disability studies, animals with disabilities, not a whole lot because I really want to get into the questions. And then I'm going to look at, we had 4 sub-questions within this like broad question, and we'll talk about some conclusions and what that really means. So the kind of leading definition, I put that in quotes because for those of us who are disability advocates, we don't necessarily think that this is the best definition, but is the most recognizable that people understand is the ADA definition. So that's a person with a disability. A person with a disability is having a mental or physical impairment that limits one or more life functions. So you see in this definition that's very individual oriented. It's your issue, right? We create a different definition based on a lot of work that's been done with both people and animals with disabilities. And so we talk about disability refers to an array of cognitive, sensory, and physical differences and capabilities that may substantially alter one or more major life functions for human and non-human animals, either completely or temporarily. It is the result of a complex relationship between an individual's health condition and the external factors representing the circumstances in which the individual lives. So how disability manifests, what that looks like, or how society defines that, depends on the environment that you're in and what you have access to. So to give a tiny, tiny bit background about why this is important and why we care, is when we look at research around how people perceive other people with disabilities, we see that about 70% of people report not being comfortable around people with disabilities. Much of this is about fear of not knowing what to say, of saying the wrong thing, not knowing how to interact. So there's this educational component that is clearly missing, and this engagement component that is clearly missing. So we did a smaller study, and we found a smaller representative sample study, and we found that 78% of people also believe that animals with disabilities are better off euthanized. So there's a lack of value for people with disabilities, and we don't see value in animals with disabilities. So we wanted to think about, are there ways that we can kind of educate people and work with animals and people with disabilities to create more positive perceptions? And we know that when we use animals to talk about disabilities, when we engage people with engaging with animals with disabilities, that this can be a really powerful practice the language around disabilities so that they aren't socially reprimanded in different ways. We see these things happen like in children's literature, and I'm not going to go in the article, we go way into this in terms of children's literature. But in children's literature, we see a lot of stuff around how do we depict complex topics or new ideas to children and have them practice those ideas with children's literature with animals instead of humans so that they can have that practice space and failure space. So we wanted to use these ideas to think about how we talk about animals with disabilities. The other thing that I want to just bring up really quickly, and you can write a number of papers on this, is how ableism and speciesism are really connected. So I'm sure everyone in this room is very familiar with speciesism, this assumption that humans are superior to animals, and it helps to normalize the exploitation of animals. Ableism is a belief and practices that help normalize the devaluation and discrimination of people with disabilities. So what we see in society is that humans with disabilities are systematically excluded from things, and animals with disabilities we often deem are better off dead or euthanized. So in both cases, we see little value for people and animals with disabilities. So let's apply this to organizations. And as I mentioned in the beginning, what I found working with a lot of zoos and aquariums across the country and a number of other animal-oriented organizations is that there is real engagement with taking care of animals with disabilities and providing them accessible habitats and various other things. But there's real disconnect in how we talk about these animals. And the fear for organizations comes kind of threefold. One, that however they depict the animal with disabilities, they'll receive criticism about the welfare of the animal or the well-being. And that people often get angry whether or not the animal lives or dies. So if you euthanize the animal, then people are angry. If you decide that we're going to invest resources into the animal to help them to have a more accessible life, people can often get angry. And then fear that you will get it wrong or that you will do more damage than good. So what does this translate to in organizations? It translates to really three things. Hiding animals with disabilities, so we're just not going to talk about it. We're just going to pretend that it doesn't exist. Hiding the disabilities that animals have. So we may acknowledge, but we're not going to discuss that disability. Or focusing on just inspirational stories. So here are the sub-questions, and we divided this really kind of into 4 distinct studies that I'm going to go through here. How are animals with disabilities being depicted in zoo and aquarium signage? So we really wanted to say, okay, we know that there is this issue, but how are zoos and aquariums depicting animals with disabilities? What are they saying about them? The second one we're going to look at is how do people respond to this different signage? What are consistent themes that we see? And then we look at what guidelines could we create for talking about animals with disabilities in the signage. And then the last we look at, can we create messaging, more effective messaging that really helps to enhance positive perceptions of both animals and people with disabilities? So for question one, which is the how are animals with disabilities being depicted in zoos and aquarium signage, we did an exploratory observation. So because of my NSF career grant, I am at zoos and aquariums all the time. They're like my second home. Um, so we visited 18 zoos and aquariums across the country, and we looked at we asked about their how the animals with disabilities that they house, and then we looked at the signage. And we were able to categorize signage into three major categories. No signage. So there's an animal in an enclosure that has a visible disability, but there's no signage. It doesn't say why, how, who, what is happening. There's detailed signage. And the detailed signage, we often heard about organizations wanting to be really transparent and upfront. So they would say everything on their signage. They would talk about the disability, how the animal got the disability, the suffering they've experienced, how long they're going to suffer. Um, I mean, it was lengthy, very lengthy. And then the simple signage saying, Joe the eagle has a disability. He's unable to fly and he likes fish and all these other things. So the disability was part of the story. There was an acknowledgement of the disability, but it wasn't the main focus of the story. So that's how zoos and aquariums are doing it. So the next thing we wanted to look at is we wanted to see how does people respond to this different signage. So we picked popular mammals with disabilities at 3 zoos and looking at those 3 different signage types. We had 2 researchers observe guests from the hours of 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. on Saturdays at each facility. And we coded the first comment that people made about the animal. And we counted the number of people, but we did not count infants or who were unable to talk. And we coded statements as either positive, neutral, or negative. So this wasn't a real intense study. It was just kind of what is happening here. So real exploratory kind of component. So what do we find? We found that the simple signage absolutely worked the best, that people were much more engaged with the animal and not necessarily the disability with the simple signage. So they said things that were really kind of interesting that kind of we also saw that they would make connections back to their own lives. So there's this connection they're making with the animal and to other people. So they'd say things like, oh, he has the same thing as my dad, and I like how the zoo is taking care of this animal. The no signage and detailed signage actually prompted a lot of welfare or well-being concerns. So we heard things like, why isn't the zoo doing anything to help him? I hate zoos because they just leave animals like this. The worst one was obviously the no signage because people could visually see that an animal had a disability and they were concerned, but they felt like the zoo was doing nothing to help the animal. Okay, so at this point, we know what zoos and aquariums are doing, and we know we have a sense of how people are engaging with this signage. So we wanted to come up with some guidelines. We looked and looked for what are the guidelines about talking about animals with disabilities. There are a number of different resources to talk about people with disabilities. And we're going to focus on the ADA again, because that is the one that people know and understand. As disability scholars, again, we are not saying that that is the best, the worst, or anything like that. We're not endorsing necessarily the ADA as the best guidelines, but it's where people generally get their foundation from. So the ADA network guidelines for writing about people with disabilities has 14 items. And we added an additional 4. So what we did is we went through those guidelines, this crew of people, 17 people. And basically what we did is we paralleled those with what would this mean for an animal and how would we address this in terms of animals. And then we added 4 that were more non-human animal oriented. So we actually have an article under review about these guidelines, and we are happy to share those with people. And at the end, if there's time, I can go over some more of the guidelines. But here are just some examples in talking about animals with disabilities. So when we talk about people with disabilities, when we talk about animals with disabilities, we want to consider what is the context? Why are we disclosing the disability? In the case of zoos and aquariums, we want to disclose the disability often because it's visual and people can tell that the animal has a disability, and we want to to let people know that the welfare concerns and the accessibility issues are being taken care of. We want to emphasize their abilities. So, those long statements about the disability that I talked about before really focused on looking at the disability, but we want to emphasize, what can the animal do? Okay, they may not be able to fly, but what can they do? Person first language. With people, this can vary because some people with disabilities don't like person first language, but with animals, we want to focus as much possible on people first language. Neutral language, we don't want to talk about animals as being victims, defectives, damaged, etc. And we would like to avoid this being hero worship or inspirational heroics. So these are just a couple. There's 14. I'm not going to present all of them, but those are just an example of some of them. And then the ones that we added is um, we don't want to characterize the severity of the disability. Just like with people, severity differs. And with animals, we don't know how animals are responding to that disability and what that means in terms of severity. So that's really a human perception of this. Animals are often really great at adapting to different things. We talk about speciesism and ableism being linked. We talk about minimizing anthropomorphizing the animal disability. So just because having a certain disability would impact us in a certain way, we don't want to put that onto the animal and say, this animal would not be able to do XYZ. We don't know that. This animal may be able to do those things, and we're putting that from a human perspective. And then we want to promote accessibility over accommodations. We're not accommodating the animal in a habitat, we're providing an accessible habitat so that they can move within the means that they have. Okay, so this gets to our final question and kind of what we were in. The whole point of this project is getting to the idea of, can we come up with effective toolbox or messages that people can use to talk about animals with disabilities? So in this question, we ask, can reading about an animal with a disability enhance positive attitudes towards animals and people with disabilities? And we apply this idea of contact theory. Again, I'm not going to go super in depth into contact theory, but the whole point of contact theory is that positive interactions can reduce prejudice and improve relationships among people. So especially with when we engage with people who have differences than us, and that helps us to better understand these people and increase our positive perceptions. Another line within contact theory talks about parasocial contact. And this is the idea that we can actually have positive perception increases based on not directly interacting with a person. This is all person focused, but we translate to animals. But that those perceptions can come from having like really intense interest and engagement with an animal or a person that we don't know directly. So we often talk about this in terms of celebrities. Like we can get really enmeshed in a celebrity's life and become concerned if they lose their house or they face an illness or any number of things. But we've never had direct contact with that celebrity. They don't know us, but still we have this parasocial contact. We see this with animals too. One of the best examples over there is Fiona the hippo. It's 8 years later, and I still celebrate Fiona's birthday every year. For those who don't know, Fiona was a hippo who was born prematurely at the Cincinnati Zoo 8 years ago, and was taken care of and survived. And now, they've done a lot in terms of talking about Fiona and marketing Fiona. And there's many of us who feel like we know Fiona. And Cincinnati is one zoo that I haven't been to. I haven't met Fiona, and still I celebrate Fiona's birthday in my classrooms when I teach every year. So that's how parasocial connections work. So what we hoped is that we would be able to write statements about these animals, about their lives, about who they are, that goes beyond their disability, and that people would be able to form connections, and that would help people to better understand and value animals with disabilities and people with disabilities. So here's what we did. We worked with the Advancing Conservation Through Empathy Network. This is called the ACE Network. They are housed at the Woodland Park Zoo, and they really focus on how do we engage people in empathy for animals. They're a network of zoos and aquariums, of research professionals, of other animal organizations. And like I said, their whole focus is really about how do we think about empathy for animals? How do we measure it? How do we connect people to animals? So we asked some zoos and aquariums for images and like bios of various animals with disabilities. So we received 17 different animals, which was really great. That include land animals, sea animals, birds, and reptiles. The categories of disability really, we found four. So one around blindness, either partial or full blindness, amputation, traumatic brain injuries, and then other visual or movement-oriented disabilities. That were things like hunchback, wean injury, those sorts of things. What you notice here is we don't have anything that deals with kind of neurodiversity or uh, those kinds of things in this. And that's something we'll talk about in terms of limitations. So no anxiety, depression, those kinds of disabilities. So we had all these images and we had these bios, and based on our guidelines and what we had seen at the zoos and aquariums, we created simple, real narratives about the animals. So these narratives did anthropomorphize the animal, but we tried to make it, we kept them within what is the realistic limits of this animal in terms of what they engage in. So, it could be things like Basil really enjoys spinach. So we kept it within what the animal would actually enjoy, but actually provide some context for the personality. We also created the perception of human and animal disability scale. And what we wanted to get here is this idea about value, about people not valuing humans or people with disabilities. So we created like a disability value scale, an animal with disability value scale. And then we wanted to get this comfort question, a comfort around people with disabilities. We didn't have a comfort around animal with disabilities. Um, because that's not as much of a relevant thing. So each scale had 3 items, and we randomly assigned an image and text to about 1,000 people in an online experiment. So what did we find? It worked. That's what we found. So what does that mean? So those who received the image and the simple text that we showed, we saw an increase in valuing animals and people with disabilities compared to those who didn't. And we also saw an increase in feeling comfortable around people with disabilities. So this supports the application of contact theory. So even in a very, very confined short span, there was this like relationship that developed. We also tested whether any image or text performed better, or any type of animal performed better, and that didn't happen. There was no image or text that performed better. We often talk about charismatic megafauna performing better in connecting people. We did not see that in this particular study. So conclusions. Um, we know that people tend to not place value on animals and people with disabilities. We know that over 70% of people feel uncomfortable around people with disabilities, and then 78% of people somewhat agree with the statement that animals with disabilities are better off euthanized. So what we wanted to do again was figure out how do we deal with some of this issue, this lack of value, this lack of comfort. And, there are a number of ways we can do that. But one thing we can do is we can work with animals with disabilities and create greater awareness and education around them. And hopefully that will help people with disabilities. We created these narratives and we saw that this worked. Um, you know, this was the final portion was all done online with people viewing these animals and the text for 30 seconds, which is not a long time. So that there's lots of room for possibilities and opportunities to do this work. Um, And I think that that is probably the most exciting part, is the amount of opportunities and possibilities with this. So there are some limitations. The observation that we did, the initial observation we did, um, with the three different treatments, the no signage, the simple signage, and the really complex tell us everything, fully transparent signage, we did three different zoos. In the ideal world, it would be great to do that all at one zoo with one single animal with one single habitat. That is virtually impossible. And that's because different zoos have different standards for how they talk about animals with disabilities. And so in one location, the standard was we don't talk about animals with disabilities. We don't bring up the signage doesn't include a conversation about the animal with disabilities. In the next one, they have real simple signage. In the next zoo, they have really complex, fully transparent signage. So you often don't see within a single zoo or aquarium all of these different components. So it makes it really hard to study within one place. The way that we thought about doing that is the ones who don't have any signage, we could test this different signage in. We haven't done that yet. But the ones who have simple signage, especially after seeing this study, are very reluctant to then take away their signage or put fully transparent signage. So we're still working on how we could deal with some of that. This experiment component was done online as kind of a first assessment of what this would look like. And this was done, this final one that I present, we did several pilot studies first to see how to get the language correct. And so we do have like a platform for what the language needs to look like. Like I said, this only focused on disabilities that were visible. Like this didn't focus on invisible disabilities. And so that's a whole nother component. Some of the questions that we have moving forward is, can this lead to long-term change? We just did this for a tiny little environment, but can we develop programs and other things around this to increase long-term change? Um, would we did this online with these online narratives? Would that produce the same thing in person? We did the observation work and we saw some differences, but we didn't take what we had actually written and put it in the environment to see if we see the same thing in person. Another thing we need to think about is, should messages be tailored to address different types of disabilities? And we tried to do this as much as possible, but obviously we are not experts on every kind of disability. So, that takes some more refinement. Another question I'm specifically interested in is, how does different signage make people with disabilities feel, see, or do they feel respected? What does that look like? I know for me, when I was at the zoos and aquariums that have no signage addressing an animal with a visible disability, that was hard to take in and hard to see, because it sends a clear message about the value of disabilities and whether or not we should be talking about them. And the next question is this idea of invisible disabilities, like I brought up before. We have to seriously think about how we address those, and also within the animal studies world, what that means. There's a lot of commentary and discussion about, what does that mean? Can animals be depressed? Can they feel anxiety? I'm sure those of us in this room would say yes, but I don't know that that's a universal sentiment that people hold. So addressing those issues. So I'll end it here, and I'll leave a lot of time for conversation and discussion. I just like to leave with this quote from Alice Wong. Advocacy is not just a task for charismatic individuals or high-profile community organizers. Advocacy is for all of us. Advocacy is a way of life, is a natural response to the injustices and inequalities in the world. And as I transition to questions, what I am really interested is, where would you all like to see this go? What would you like to see in terms of studies and things that we need to address? And the final thing I'll say is a special thanks to all these people below, who were very important in the project. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fabulous talk. It's a lot to think about. We already have some questions in the chat. I'm gonna turn the screen, your screen off so that we can see you as
Great.
you answer, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna start. When is Fiona's birthday?
It is January, I believe it's January 25th, but we always celebrate the first week back from break in my classroom. And I always bring a cake, and then we watch videos of her when she was a baby. It's a whole thing. And then we talk about the representation of animals with disabilities, not with disabilities, the animals in general, and what that means. Yeah.
Ah, okay, cool. All right, so we have just a simple question that I'll start with. Someone wants to know if you've published this yet.
No, we haven't. So, it actually showed up on my desk yesterday that all the authors have approved it to be sent out. So we will be sending it out hopefully later today or early tomorrow. Yeah. The guidelines they are under review. So hopefully those will get published pretty soon. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a question from Corey Wren. Corey, I'm just going to read this as it is, unless you, if I'm butchering it, feel free to turn off your microphone and chime in. But Corey says, oops, someone just commented, I lost it. Give me 1 second. Corey says that it seems underpinning the study, but is the purpose here to teach and is the purpose here to use animals in zoos to teach? It is interesting. Some people were aware of the oppressive nature of zoos, but how did this surface in the interpretation of disability with regards to disabilities that zoos cause versus the animals they take in? It seems problematic to frame zoos as sanctuaries, pro-animal education spaces, or safe zones for animals. One of my first lessons on animal rights was visiting a zoo as a child and seeing the neuroses that were very observable in the behaviors of animals kept in small enclosures with no stimulation.
Yeah. Yes, yes, all of that. Um, yeah, so first of all, hey Corey, it's great to have you in the room. Um, so I will start by saying if someone had told me 10 years ago that I would be working with zoos and aquariums, I would have said, you are crazy. That would not be happening. Um, but this has been a really fun and interesting experience. And so what I will say is, yeah, there is no way that I think that zoos and aquariums are sanctuaries, but I do think they are important educational spaces. And I think my experience is that not all zoos are created the same, and not all people working at zoos are created the same. And that they have different motivations and different interests and all kinds of things. So uh, I really like working with the ACE network because that is a group of zoos and aquariums and professionals and researchers who are interested in addressing these questions about how do we care for animals? How do we better care for animals? Addressing these hard conversations about should zoos exist? Why do they exist? How do they exist? How do we address animals with disabilities, that animals that come to zoos with disabilities, animals that get disabilities while in zoos? And aquariums. And so, I don't have a perfect answer. I don't think there is a perfect answer, but I think it's important that we simultaneously have conversations about whether or not zoos and aquariums should exist, but also have the reality that zoos and aquariums do exist, and are there ways that we can um, better support the animals in these organizations and people engaging with them? Are there ways that we can do that? Um, and what do those things look like? So I don't know that I fully answered that question, but ultimately, I think that these are critical conversations that we just have to continue to have. And I think it's important to continuously bring these issues up about um, what is the point of a zoo and aquarium. And I think also for some zoos and aquariums, they're questioning those things too, right? Like what is their point? What are they there for? How do they better inspire conservation? Do they inspire conservation at all? yeah, those are all kind of important pieces of that.
Thank you. We have a question from Angie.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks very much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. So I just have a question about the study on people's perception of animals with disabilities and the relationship between that and their thinking that euthanasia would be good for those animals.
Mhm.
It's just a question about like how that question itself was framed for the participants in that study, because I find it both I find it not surprising and surprising all at once. I guess it depends, I guess, on how we understand what disability is. So, what made me
Sort of.
think of this is that lots of people live with companion animals with disabilities. Is it that they don't recognise in those impairments as disabilities, as disabling, or yeah, like so? I just wonder whether you could say a bit more about what's going on there.
Yeah, those are questions that we've been kind of grappling with too, and I think some of that is correct. I think you are right on that. Even if you have an animal with disabilities, that you don't necessarily recognize the animal has disabilities, and even myself, right? So my dog has pretty severe arthritis, and we have a number of things to help her, you know, function better in her environment, and to help us in her environment. Um, but if someone instantly, I was just thinking about this. If someone instantly asked me, does your dog have a disability? I'd be like, no, no. But she does. Like she very clearly does. She has a very hard time walking and takes medication and has different apparatuses to help her navigate her environment. So I think some of it is that. The question that we asked was really about this statement about, do you think animals with disabilities would be better off euthanized? I think a lot of times when people think about people and animals with disabilities, that they have a certain image in mind, and that image is often an individual who ha has very little world that we have created. And I say that in the way that it's an environmental thing, right? It's a thing that in another environment that same disability might not be present, but that's how people have this perception. And so I think you're right that they are thinking, um, and thinking about some of the open-ended comments about animals who are unable to move at all, or animals who are unable to drink or eat, or, they're going to kind of an extreme end. So yeah, I do think that's true. And part of that is working with people to reconceptualize what they think about disabilities and how they imagine disabilities, that it's not a catastrophe in this way, but it's different abilities and different ways that people navigate the world daily, and animals navigate the world. Yeah.
Thank you. Mark has a question that I'm really interested in because on my IG, I follow Goats of Anarchy. And so
Mm.
this question is, what do you make of projects such as Goats of Anarchy? And if you don't know Goats of Anarchy, they take in goats, specifically goats with disabilities, and their attempt is to help them live a fun life, right? So what do you make of projects such as Goats of Anarchy that take in lots of disabled animals to a single sanctuary and showcase them a lot on social media? They seem to gather a committed group of followers and supporters. Do they help move the imagination in a helpful direction?
Yeah. So personally, I love Goats of Anarchy. We have my kid is 5, and we have a bunch of the books that they've produced as well. So I think they are great. I think, what I have seen with my kid, in terms of the organization is, um, when we've read the books, he has some really great questions about disabilities and about the different, tools that the animals use to move around, and the different ways they move around, and that's exciting. And I feel like, at least on my end, having a child, that has helped him better understand people with disabilities because he is making those connections. And so I think it's actually really exciting. I think there are different ways of looking at this too, though. We could say that they are also using, one perspective would be to say that they are using these animals, and that they may or may not have an impact, but they are using these animals to produce profit and produce all kinds of different things. But in my personal perspective, I think it's been really, really positive. I'd be interested to know what people in the audience think, as well. Carol, what do you think?
This is the first time I'm thinking about some of this, but I was wondering whether the space that these things happen in might matter, right? So, because of speciesism, we feel differently about animals, regardless of species, based on how they're classified by our uses, right?
Yeah.
So, um, I'm sure in the zoo, some of these animals evoke sympathy, but if it was a companion animal, it might evoke empathy. Um, so I'm not sure because representation matters, but I'm not a disability scholar either. And that actually touches on a question that I had written down during your presentation for you, is that you said that ableism and speciesism are connected. And I see similarities in their structures, obviously. But I was hoping you could explain a little bit more about how you see these two concepts really intertwined besides the specific examples of the animals where you were studying them.
Yeah, for sure. Go back to my thing here. Doo-doo. Um, I think this gets so complicated. What I see a lot in this work is that, well, what I do a lot of work related to values, and I see this is really connected to valuing and this idea of values. And so um, I see the connection really at being um, a value framework sense. So this idea that one type of animal or creature or whatever is more important or valuable to society or has the right to more resources or whatever over another. And that's with speciesism, it's this assumption that humans are superior. And we see this in ableism. It's this assumption that if you are able-bodied, you are superior. And that the world we create for you, as someone with a disability is your problem to kind of deal with. And we do this with animals too, that if an animal doesn't, if we need a space and we're taking over a habitat, if an animal doesn't fit, well, that's not really our problem. It's the animal's problem. And we just kind of put that off. And so I see this connection really more in terms of a value and kind of a hierarchy in how we think about things. That both are there's a hierarchy in the situation and not a recognition of um, kind of parallel existence or um, access to resources or different things. There's a definite sense that people and animals with disabilities maybe shouldn't have resources that other people have, or maybe we're spending too many resources on people and animals with disabilities. That's another question that we've used in previous work, that kind of get at this, is that, do you think we spend too many resources and too much time on addressing people with disabilities? And then we ask the same kind of question in terms of animals with disabilities, and people overwhelmingly say yes. So you see, that's how I kind of envision these different connections. Um, yeah, there's also there's some great books and articles, that we draw from in terms of our article that will be under review soon, that kind of makes that a tighter connection.
Thank you. You asked in the beginning future directions that we'd like to see. I think it would be, I mean, this is maybe years down the road, or maybe you've done a little bit of it on another project, but I think really exploring the hierarchies, since we are speciesist, we are ableist. There's this, different animals rank higher. People have different perspectives of different disabilities. It might be interesting to look and see like how these inequalities are working and rank ordered to maybe unveil a little bit more of some of the problems.
Yeah. I love that you bring that up because in our study, and we haven't done anything with this data, we did have people rank order disabilities based on their comfort level. And so gain at some of that would be really cool. And then also rank order their connection to different types of animals, which gets at some of that. And, we've seen with the sociozoological scale, sociozoological scale and other things, but I think we could get at some of those with some of the data we do have. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I'd love to see that in the future. We have a lot more questions and not a lot of time. One question from Hannah, I'll try to boil it down a little bit is just, do you think that if you were to do the same study that was looking at free living or wild animals, that you would be seeing some of the same things? She says zoos inherently create a level of both unnatural comfort and domination that people feel. So do you think that that would impact what you would find?
Hmm. I love this question. And I don't know. And I say that because so I live in Bellingham, Washington, and it's a very wooded area, and we have a deer who has a very significant limp that's kind of in our neighborhood. And there's a lot of love and compassion for this deer. And the what happens in terms of our community is the people call about this deer and tell the wildlife services here all the time about this deer and come help this deer, and they won't do anything because this is a natural occurrence and the deer is fine and moving around and everything. And but there's this, like, everyone loves this deer, and part of it is because this deer has been individualized. Like, we can depict this deer, we can point out this deer from the other ones that exist. So I don't know in that. But I think doing something around wildlife would be really, really exciting. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I'm taking notes.
I think we have time for one more question. It'll be quick though. We're almost at the end here. So I'll take a question from Brogan, who has their hand raised.
Hi, I actually study wild and free-ranging, physically impaired and disabled monkeys.
Sweet.
Super
To
random.
connect.
Yeah. So I have so many questions, but I know that you're running out of time. I'm always, when I present at conferences and talk about my research, I'm always really careful about like, how I talk about it, of course. But something that I thought was like important, but you never mentioned it. So now I'm like, oh, maybe I'm overdoing it, is talking about the difference between physically impaired and disabled. Because I always made such a distinction with that every time in a conference, but maybe that's not as important. I'm not sure. And like I said, I have other questions, but I'll just leave it at that so other people can ask.
Yeah, no, I think Hmm. That's a really interesting question. And you're right, in this presentation I did a presentation with Stanford not too long ago talking about people with disabilities and primarily looking at faculty with disabilities and what that looks like. And we did talk more about that, but the audience was a bunch of disability scholars, and so we could get like more into this like disability language and disability kind of scholar work. Yeah, I don't know. I think what I would say is, I think it often depends on the audience. Like, it just depends on where's that conversation going to land. I think, like with the Stanford audience, that was a really important kind of space to have those conversations. But for a community like this, where the focus is not necessarily on those absolute distinctions and all of that, all of those components. It's really focused on like this kind of practical component, like are there things that we can do and how do we make these connections? And I'm unsure of the level of knowledge or understanding of any number of terms. Keeping it more less focused on that language, I think is often good. But I think you kind of just have to feel that out as a presenter. But I would love to talk more with you about some of the stuff we're doing. And we are always looking for people to be on board because the more people that we can have engaged with this work is really helpful. And so, yeah, if you are interested in kind of making those connections and connecting, that would be great. Please email me.
I will do. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, we are almost at the top of the hour, so I'm sorry that I didn't get to everyone's questions, but that's a really good sign that this was so engaging for the audience. So I'd like to thank you so much, Cameron, for such a great talk. And I'd like to let everyone know I dropped in the chat flyers for the next two colloquiums that we'll have. We're only having 2 more this academic year, and then we'll pick them up again in the fall. Our next one is talking about inedibility in literature, in Indian literature, both fiction and nonfiction. And the one in May is going to be about the connections between animal abuse and intimate partner violence. And we've got 2 great speakers for both of those. I will email everyone with the recording of this talk once it's ready sometime in the next week, and I'll attach those flyers to that as well. So with the last 2 minutes we have left, I would like to thank you, Cameron, and if you have any last thought that you want to make sure, or last thing that you want to make sure you say before we leave, I want to let you have the last word.
Just thank you for having this space to talk about people and animals with disabilities and for the great questions and considerations. And please, anything you have, please feel free to email me and reach out. This work is so important and I value all the things that you have to contribute and talk about. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. And Cameron dropped their email in the chat, so you can grab it there. I'll hang out for a minute if anyone needs to copy anything down from the chat. But thank you so much, everybody, and have a good rest of your week.